Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Stephen Christian. I am an animator, a storyteller. I'm also in medical school, so in my summer break, I like to make stuff and teach stuff. And today we'll be talking about introductions to animation. This isn't necessarily focused around diving deep into a specific style of animation, but just introducing the core concept. And once you have the core concepts, I mean, like you could apply it to really pretty much anything. Uh, my background, uh, my background, and a lot of my experience in animation has been with compositing and visual effects, and so essentially taking live action footage and applying animation principles to it. And so, pretty much, these rules can be, applied to any workflow that you want to in a variety of different mediums. And so, before we dive deep into like animation and all that stuff, like I mentioned before, I'm a content creator. I do a lot of different things. I've been featured in the Wall Street Journal. I do a lot of stuff with this a company called Unity, Unity Technologies. I have been featured in the Augmented World Expo, HBO. I used to have a comic strip in the Willand Weekly, and just I teach Skillshare courses and stuff. So I like to stay busy, and I like to just explore ideas and create things that are interesting and fun. And so here's just sort of a list of titles that I've just acquired over the course of my professional career. I used to play at Oregon State. I played football, and then from there I retired and became an animator. And then I sort of left animation for a little bit and decided to try to go to medical school, and that's how I ended up in Portland. And then after finishing up at Portland State, it takes a lot longer to get into animation or get into medical school. So then I started a tech company and got into augmented reality. And then I got into medical school, and now I'm trying to juggle everything. So it's fun. But among other things, I love snowboarding and just creating comics and just doing just really interesting things in life. Just because why not? And so here's just a little demo of just some of the work that I do, just to give you an idea of just like what I do. And so, for the most part, what you saw was just a combination of like 2D, 3D, comics, augmented reality. Just what I like to do and enjoy doing is trying to find the intersections between all those different mediums, and then being able to create immersive experiences that people could just access with their phones. And so, if you have the content, you have an access point, and then you just sort of share it and enjoy the experiences. And so for today, we will be talking about sort of like the basics of animation, what it is, what is the process of it, and then exploring, what some software can be used to animate. And then we'll be diving deep into, how Pascal works. If we have time, or if you guys want to, or if you have accounts already, we could go over how I animate in Adobe Animate, because that's how I do most of my animation. And then we'll just sort of just jam it out and see what we come up with the rest of the time. So before we get started, are there any questions? Yeah.
I was curious for the piece that you shared with us, how long did it take you to create that?
Off and on. I think the average time that I spend on like an animated thing right now would be probably like 4 to 5 hours to do like a quick, animated loop. And those animated loops are typically like, I would say probably 20 to 30 frames. And so my average, if I'm doing like 2D animation, I'm averaging probably like 3 to 4 hours per second of animation, and that's a pretty good rate of rate to work with. And so to give you just sort of a context, right? Like if you're working on a 60-second animation, expect expect to spend about 3 to 5 hours per second, and then multiply that times 60. And that's how long it takes to animate something essentially.
And that's even before editing process.
Yeah. So before the editing process and stuff, so you still have to do your storyboards, and you still have to do all those sort of prep things. But when you sit down to animate, it's just sort of the hours you got to put in, and it's put on a podcast, put on an audiobook, and just jam it out. Okay. Any more questions before we get started? Nope, we're good. Awesome. So, the goal for now is, we'll look at, types of animation. We'll look at some of the animation anatomy, try to break it down. And then I'll go through essentially some different exercises that can sort of help you get started with, applying the foundations or the topics of foundations into practice. And so animation in general is, because we all like definitions and we all need definitions kind of. Animation in a nutshell is series. It's pretty much images that are played in series or sequence. And in some way, shape, or form, people use animation as a way to show motion across time. And so typically when you go to an art gallery or you look at a picture, the picture is static. And so as time progresses, the picture doesn't change. Within animation, what you're doing is you're allowing for a process for motion to take place by showing multiple pictures over time. And that ends up being what is known as a sequence. And it's no different than how cameras work for video production. It's no different than how games work for like frame rate and everything. Everything in our lives are pretty much animation. If you see somebody moving in front of you, your mind is actually just taking pictures of those sort of snapshots and then playing it over time. And so life is animation in a nutshell. And so different types of animation, there's tons of types of animation, but the most popular ones are 2D and 3D. You may be familiar with, Leica, which is down in, I can't remember where they're like. Yeah, they're like Milwaukee or whatever. But Leica does a lot of like claymation and stop motion. Then there's hand drawn, and hand drawn is known as traditional. There's a lot of overlaps and there's a lot of in-betweens. And I used to do a lot of compositing and live action and visual effects, but for the most part, you can pretty much animate anything. You can animate clay, you can animate pictures, you can animate sticks. Anything can be animated, and applying principles to the medium and the objects that you choose, gives you different effects. And so the components of animation are frames, keyframes, sequences, frame rate, and then timeline. Those are the core components of what an animation comprises of. And so frames are literally just the pictures, each individual picture that shows on a screen. If you pause a video that is animated, or just to pause a video in general, that one picture that shows up in the pause is going to be that frame. Keyframes are the core frames that you pretty much spend all your time trying to create, because those show the beginning and the end of what that animated motion is. And so the difference between just a picture and animation is that with a picture, you're just sort of showing an instance of life. Whereas a keyframe it is a picture, but it's a picture focused on showing either the beginning or an end of a motion. And so with animation, again, we're focused on the motion. And if you're able to focus on the motion, then that's how you become a better animator. Because it's not about drawing the best pictures, it's all about creating the best illusion of motion within an image or an image sequence. Which leads me to sequences. So sequences are the series of pictures, the series of frames that you need to show the illusion of motion. And so within a sequence, you may have, 10 keyframes, or you may have, 20 frames. But putting those all together and playing those over time will show the illusion of, motion, and that will be your sequence. And you could have hundreds of thousands of sequences in a show, in a movie, and those sequences are essentially a collaboration of different frames and a collaboration of different elements within those frames that give you that effect. And so from sequences, you have to understand what a frame rate is, because what a frame rate does is it says, hey, this sequence that I have, it may be 60 frames, and we're going to play those 60 frames over 3 seconds, or 2 seconds, or 1 second. And so what the frame rate does is it says that based on what you set, you will, that's how many frames it takes for you to go 1 second, 2 seconds, or 3 seconds. And so we should be familiar with, you should be familiar with like, FPS, the term FPS if you like play games, or if you're in video production, like, 30 frames per second, 24 frames per second, 60 frames per second, 90 frames per second. Those are all frame rates. And so in animation, typically your animated frame rate to get the best bang for your buck is between, 12 and 24. Ideally, most people like to do 16 just because it gives you the good illusion of motion. It gives you a nice fluid sequence without you having to draw 30 individual pictures to get that effect. And often playing around with frame rate can save yourself some time. And so I mentioned that it takes me about 3 to 4 hours per second of animation. If I were to drop down to 12 or 8 frames per second, then I can save myself maybe an hour. And so at 8 frames per second, I could actually animate something in 1.5 to 2 hours, just because it's just the amount of frames that I need to show that image, or to show that sequence. But if you're looking for like more 3D animated stuff, then you're looking at more 30 to 60 frames. If you're doing games, it's definitely going to be 60. And if you're doing like virtual reality experiences, then it'll be more 90. And that's mainly because when you have a headset, your body perceives 90 as like more realistic, and you won't get motion sickness. And that's just how it is. But most TVs will be at 24 frames per second. So anything that you see on cable, 24 frames or 30 frames. And so that it's good to know that, because you probably don't want to do a 60-second animation if people are only going to see it at 24 frames per second. Then it's like you could have saved yourself so much time working on other stuff, right? And then a timeline. A timeline is essentially like where the sequence exists, and it's the anchor for how you interpolate your frame rate. And so on a timeline, you'll have all of your frames on the timeline, and from that timeline, you can say, okay, this frame is going to have 2 frames, or going to represent 2 frames. This frame is going to represent 3 frames. This frame is going to represent 4 frames, and it'll run at 60 frames per second. And so it sort of gives you that visual representation of how you should be organizing your sequence. And so when we get to the software, I'll show you, you'll be able to see what all these things mean. And then, you'd be like, okay, let me just play around with the timeline. Let me play around with the frame rate, the series and sequences, and all that. And so just a little list of software that we have for animation. a lot of the free ones, there's free ones and then there's paid ones. With the free ones, we should all hopefully be familiar with Blender. Blender is sort of a monster and a beast of everything. And so with Blender, you can do 2D animation and 3D animation. Pascal, which is one that we'll be, playing around with today. And that one, you're able to do 2D animation, and this 2D animation is more pixel based. So it's sort of like blocky, 8-bit. It's a particular style, but it allows for you to apply the principles pretty easily. Then there's one called OpenToons, which is actually it is a former proprietary software from Studio Ghibli. And so once Studio Ghibli like moved on to their like more modern softwares, they essentially just posted this as an open source program. And so if you love Studio Ghibli, if you love the style of those animated shows or animated movies, you can check out OpenToons. It can get a little complicated, but hey, I mean, like they made stuff with it, so it works. Then there's paid ones like Toon Boom and Adobe Animate. I use Adobe Animate. I think I've used it for about 12 years at this point, and prior to that, because it used to be known as Adobe Flash or Flash. So any of those like YouTube stick animations or like YouTube animation in and of itself was sort of built on Flash, and Adobe Animate is sort of like the evolution of that. And so I use that program, and then Toon Boom is a pretty much an industry standard. It's really expensive. It used to be really expensive. I think they have like a subscription now, but Toon Boom is pretty much what they use for like Young Justice and like the Justice League and like all those like major animated shows that you'll see on TV. And so that's more of an industry standard one. And then, just sort of steps to create animation in and of itself. It's pretty simple once you actually like lay down the steps. It's just that the steps can take forever to finish. It can take days, it can take weeks, just because there's a lot of details that go into them. And so normally people will start off, or animators will start off with a script, and that's just writing out the actions that you hope to animate or that you intend on animating. And then you'll go into a storyboarding phase, which is just sketching drafts of what those key poses are. You're not actually doing the animation, you're just sort of laying out what the animation will kind of look like. And that could be either stick figures, or it could be actual, rendered figures, or rendered whatever it is. And then once you do that, you'll convert those to keyframes within a software, and then you'll start doing in-betweens. And in-betweens are literally what what it is in the name, where you have a key pose, you have another key pose, and then you'll actually draw a picture just that fits in between the motions to show that motion. And so if somebody is going to do a punch, you're going to sort of show somebody cocking back, another keyframe of somebody like punching, and then having a keyframe in the middle where it's sort of some combination of like this motion. And so then you'll have like your impact frames, which are, the anticipation and the overshoot. And those are just to make it feel more impactful. I try not to use the like actual word, but like make it feel more impactful. It's the things that like we remember about the animation. It's like, oh wow, that was cool. Those are where those go in. And then there's this whole phase of cleaning up the animation, going from sketching to actual like clean lines. And then you'll have the coloring or the coloring and the toning, which gives it a little more depth and it gives more life. And then you have the effects, and then you have the composite, right? And so when I mentioned about how it takes me 3 to 4 hours to animate stuff, most of that 3 to 4 hours is done in the in-betweens and the impact. And then once you get to the cleanup and the color, you're essentially tracing over the lines that you've already done. And then you're coloring and you're adding color to it. And then the effects and the composite, that's a whole completely different process. And so if you're working as an animator, typically you'll probably only be doing one or two of the lines on that list, and then you'll probably be working with a team that allows you to that does the other stuff. Because there's some people that are just really good at colors and are not that great at in betweens, and vice versa. And for me, I was a compositor, so I would get all those frames, and then I would actually just like put it together and have all the effects, all the flares, all the shakes, and all that stuff, and then we'll send it off to the director and stuff like that. So it's a lot of jobs. And so, with that animation process, uh, my process, I tend to use everything in, approach things in drafts, especially if I'm working on it by myself. Mainly because, it's once you get the formula down, then the best way to improve is just sort of applying the formula to those ideas. And you tweak it, may see what works for yourself, X, Y, and Z. And so the first draft that I have is normally just having those key poses, and then the in betweens, and then those impact frames, where it's like the anticipation, the overshoot, the squash and stretch, all that. Once I get it down to something that looks, you know, doesn't look good, but it looks smooth, it looks fluid, then I start to clean it up so that it starts to actually look better. And then once I get to draft 3, then I'm coloring it, and then draft 4, I'm adding the effects and everything. And so here's an example of what that actually looks like. So this is essentially draft 1, the one at the top left. This is draft 1, and this is just me getting the idea down, making sure it's smooth enough, and then going from there. So this is the early draft of the sequence. And so it's pretty quick, doesn't take too long, but it just gives me the idea of it. So I'll just play it again. And so, mind you, this is not ready to be shown to anybody, right? This is just for me to work with. But when you're working on something like this, it's you have to start somewhere, and then once you start somewhere, then you're able to build off of it. And so from here, then I start to make the motion a little bit cleaner, but it still looks rough. And so I don't have the background in there because I realized through the process of the draft that the background isn't going to change, so I'll just work on that later. But I made the motion a little bit more. More smooth, and then I also added some other elements for other characters into it. So it's a little easier to recognize now. And then this is draft 3, where they have color. Everything is sort of coming together, and it looks a lot smoother now. And so going from draft 1 to draft 3, night and day. And then last but not least, have everything with the background, and this is draft 4. And it, has all the effects, it's composited, it has everything that you expect from something that you would see on a screen. And so with that last clip, I did a combination of both 2D and 3D work in it. The characters in the foreground, a lot of the character stuff was done in 2D, but then I built out the animated background in 3D. And the reason I do that is just because it makes life easier. It's you don't have to worry about those like core details, like those little itty bitty details that you have to draw. If you just have a 3D model, you can just put those in place. And so the difference between 2D and 3D often is that, in 2D animation, you have something that's two-dimensional. And often you have to do everything frame by frame because you're responsible for drawing everything, or responsible for placing those elements in that frame for that frame. And so drawing is really key. You're able to do compositing and overlay effects, but it's really focused around the 2D nature of the screen that you have. So it's an illusion. You're not really, the world that you build is an illusion that's flat. And it's flat in every, it's just flat. It's just really flat. And so in 3D animation, you're working in 3 dimensions. Obviously, that's where you get 3D. And it's procedural. And so what that means is that you aren't responsible for every single frame that shows on the screen. In many ways, it can be a shortcut because you only have to set up the before and the after, and then the computer software actually does all the rest, like the in betweens for you, which is really great. The only problem is that if the computer messes up, you have to fix it yourself, and you have to know how to fix it. And so going from frame by frame, where you're completely responsible for every single frame, uh, 3D animation can actually save you a lot of time. And if you set up everything right at the beginning, then it makes it a lot easier in the end. And with 3D animation, like you can incorporate coding, you can incorporate 3D modeling and all that. And so typically, the path of least resistance for me that gives me the bang for my buck is I'll deal with my character animation in 2D, and then I'll deal with my backgrounds and my environments in 3D. That way, I could set up my camera angles, and then I could animate the way I want to without having to worry about doing too much. And so here is, uh, yeah, I guess I'll show what this is. Doo-doo-doo. So so since we are in Portland State and we're actually in the lab that I used to like animate in when I first got into animation, I figured it'd be cool to show my animated thing that I actually worked on here. And so I spent probably, I'll say, a couple of weeks on this. Looking back at it, I'm like, this kind of sucked, but I appreciate it. Because it's you'll see sort of the evolution of it as we go from this one to the next one. So I'll sort of play this one. Yep. And so with that was all 2D. And so what I learned over time is that, okay, little things that don't necessarily move can be done in other, you can utilize software for that. And it just, the difference is that it'll modify your style. But if you're able to sort of adapt your style to it, then it works. And it saves you a lot of time.
So like when you were looking at the school and then I kind of panned up so you can automate that, you don't have to, is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, so essentially all those different backgrounds that you see with all the little details, and you might see like a little rock in the corner and all that.
Yeah.
Typically you have to just draw all that stuff out. But you have to draw all of it to detail. But when you have the combination of 3D and 2D, you can actually find models. You can find different. You get 3D scan things. Like you could take things and have details in it without having to draw it. And so it just sort of frees up your time to focus on other stuff within your animated thing. and it just gives you more sort of like wiggle room and more bandwidth. And so it, for animators, it's liberating because you know that you don't have to spend 3 hours rendering something because you have a 3D model and you can just drag it and drop it in there. So now you have that additional 3 hours to focus on something that you really care about, and it allows for you to just come up with different ideas that make the animated segment that you're working on more impactful, and it just kind of just adds up. And so 5 years later, as I mentioned here, 5 years later, this is sort of what I came up with, and technically this was like 2 years ago, and so I definitely progressed even further. But I'll share this. And so going from the first one that I had, which felt very like static, to this one where you see changes in camera angles, you see panning and zooming, you see a lot more effects and overlays. Being able to combine both 2D and 3D allows for you to do that, to where you have a city scene and you have a city setting, and when you have that sort of circling camera angle, you don't have to draw every single frame of that building moving at once, right? You can just move the camera and then you can focus on the characters. And so just sort of being able to set up things in 3D for things that don't necessarily need to move in those ways. And then it frees you up to create character effects and animation that feels a lot more alive, right? Uh-oh. Why do I have this? Oh, okay. And so some other examples are, so some other examples are these here, which are, sort of the evolution of it, I guess, which these are in 3D. And so I'll just sort of play some examples here, and then we'll dive into some principles. And so that's sort of the work that I do, and that's sort of the philosophy that I have behind, how to animate and how I approach animation. Um, and so now we'll sort of talk about some principles of animation. Uh, there are 12 principles of animation, but technically there's only like, maybe five that like you actually apply on a regular basis. Others are sort of like approaches to creating animated movies or animated videos. And so, we have the core concept of squash and stretch, which in a way allows you to give the illusion of motion with your characters and your objects. And so if something is rigid or doesn't, squash and stretch as much, then they give the illusion of being more rigid and heavier. And if something is a squishy and it squishes and stretches a lot more, then it gives the illusion of it being softer and more malleable. And essentially, when you look at different animated shows, when you look at different sequences, this is used very regularly to give that sort of like that dynamic feel within character motions and object interactions. And so then you have timing and motion, and timing and motion is really focused around on a timeline. How do things progress from the first frame to the second frame? And so that allows you to show if something is moving slow or if something is moving fast. And so if something is moving fast, then like things are going to zip by from point A to point B a lot faster, and you're going to have less frames in it. If you have more frames, then it's going to give the illusion of it being slower. Anticipation is this, people don't necessarily notice it, but if you're familiar with like boxing or like martial arts, there's this idea of telegraphing. And so if you're telegraphing telegraphing is the consequence of somebody trying to, do a motion, but also giving it away before they do it. And so if somebody is going to throw something, their shoulder's probably going to move, their head is going to move in that direction. And then often their arm is going to move back in order for that motion to actually happen. And anticipation really plays on that because it says that when we look at motion, we expect there to be an anticipation frame or a motion that counters that motion in the beginning. So we want to wind up for a pitch, right? People don't just pitch, they wind up and then they pitch. Staging is it's more about composition, I would say. And so it's not necessarily it's more of an element for storyboarding rather than actually putting into place animation. Because all staging says is that you want the audience to understand in the frame of the animation what is actually going to happen in that animation. And so think about staging is just creating a nice composition. I don't know why they didn't use composition. They don't use composition as the term, but it's essentially composition. Follow through and overlap. Though that is when I mentioned impact frames. Follow through and overlap are essentially next to anticipation in the concept of impact frames. And what follow through says is that even like instead of us anticipating something in a motion, at the end of that motion, you're actually going to follow through and go past the actual intended destination. And so when somebody is throwing a punch, you have an anticipation where they're going to go back and then they're going to do a motion. But once they actually connect, they actually go past the actual destination that they have, and then they'll somehow like go like sort of sling back to that destination. And so with follow through and overlap, it's really telling you that this is the end of that action that you're going to see within a sequence. Then you have like straight ahead and pose to pose action. These are approaches to animation, and I would argue that they're not necessarily principles because you're only going to animate so many ways. And so, by nature of animating something, you're either going to go straight ahead, which is instead of like making all your keyframes first, you're going to just make one frame to the next frame to the next frame till you get to the end of that action in the sequence. Whereas pose to pose is you're going to make the poses of your keyframes. Then you're going to make you're going to make your middle keyframe, which is your in between those two keyframes. Then you're going to go from the middle to the beginning and you're going to make a middle one. And then from the middle to the end, you're going to make a middle one. So it's sort of working from the outside in and then outside in, outside in. And so it's more methodical. I enjoy doing that a lot more because I feel like I could stay organized. Because you could get easily lost in the keyframes, but it is what it is. And so slow in and out, or another way of thinking about this is like easing in and easing out. It's what you would have after you have your anticipation keyframe and before you have your follow through keyframe. And so if we were to sort of split these up into, with each motion, what keyframes do you need? You have your main keyframe, which is the starter. You have your anticipation. Then after your anticipation, you have your slow E. You have your ease in. Then you have your in between, and then right before you have your final keyframe, you will have your ease out. Then you'll have your follow through, and then you'll have your keyframe, your last keyframe. And so you can literally just follow that to a T for every single action in your animated sequence, and you can make a whole movie from there. Just knowing how to apply those. Arcs just say that with every motion, you don't do a straight line; you actually do a curved line. And so with every motion that you have, whether it's a head turn or a punch, don't think about the path of least resistance being from point A to point B. Think about sort of a scenic route from point A to point B. Exaggeration just says, don't make it stiff. Make it bouncy and bubbly. Make it the most realistic thing you could possibly do. And think about it being the most dramatic way to draw or show something. And then secondary action, again, isn't necessary. I don't really think that that's a core principle because it's, I guess it is in terms of like the making an animated movie. But secondary action just means that if something happens with one character or one object, you should have a follow-up action with another character or another object to ground the actual sequence or the actual events that happen. And so it very much in the same vein of if you have a character with a dialogue, it's probably good to have that character talking to somebody, even if that character doesn't talk, and just having them being able to react. And so I would say that's more of like, it's great for writers to apply. It's great for animators that are working within storylines. But if you're trying to just sort of practice these core principles, like secondary action is very contextual, and you could apply it if you want, but it's not necessary. Solid drawings, again, that one is really helpful for when you finish an animation. It's probably good to have something that's clearly defined, but to learn how to animate, you don't need to know how to draw solid lines or have solid drawings. If you're just trying to apply the principles. And then appeal just is, give your characters personality, like give the objects personality. Don't let them be dull and boring. But I think that is independent of actually learning the core principles of animation, just to animate. And so, talked about like anticipating and overshooting, exaggeration. Those are just sort of core principles that help and they're great. And typically when you have like a frame sheet, it pretty much just looks like a lot of different pictures that show up on a sheet. And so if we were to line these up on a timeline and you press play, you would see this all as one fluid motion. And that has a lot of personality to it. But in a nutshell, like it's they're all individual drawings that you draw anyway. And so with that, we will have some time to go into Piskel. So let me try to get this, and I will try to open up my, is this it? Okay, there you go. Open up Piskel now. So I have a tablet, and so I'm just going to move everything over to the tablet and swap this out. So I think that is it. Yes. And then I will switch this over. Oh, is this the same thing? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so I think this is so Piskel is showing on both the stream and is it showing on StreamYard? It's good. Okay, cool, awesome. That was a lot easier to navigate now. So hopefully you guys had enough time to play around with Piskel and see what it's all about. Piskel is a pixel-based, or it's a sprite animator, and it's great for creating pixel art. It's great for creating like animated GIFs, and it's browser-based, so you technically don't have to download anything. And so we will start to apply some of those principles to this. Yeah. Huh? Oh, nice. Yeah, so I am going to, we will get it started. So the goal here is, let me just try to pull up the PowerPoint again. The goal here is to try to, in our first exercise, making a ball bounce and having that ball bounce and sort of give different weights to that ball, right? And so once I pull this back up, through that, first we'll just sort of like see what Piskel is all about. This may just be a review if you guys already played around with it already. But to get started, just go ahead and click Create Sprite. And when you click Create Sprite, it will take you to a canvas. And this canvas is pretty much where all the magic happens. And so with it, you'll notice that there is, you have these, essentially a pen that you could use, and you can create different, line drawings from pixels. But if you did not want to, but if you didn't want the pixels to be so large, you could actually change the resolution of it. And so by going to Preferences and then going to what it says Resize right here, you could actually increase the pixel density of your canvas, and that allows for you to have a skinnier lines essentially. And so you'll be able to fit more information within your frame. And by doing that, you're able to, have more robust or more, more dynamic motions. The only caveat is that because this is focused around creating pixel-based stuff, there is a limit to what you could actually the resolution of it. But we could go to maybe 300 for the height and the width. And you'll see that if you change the width to 300, it'll change the height automatically. And that's mainly because we have the maintain aspect ratio, maintain aspect ratio uh, checked. And then when you have your anchors, what the anchors do is it says when you're trying to increase or decrease your size, you could change the anchor to the center point, and then it's going to essentially increase in every single distance equally. If you choose it around the top, then it's going to focus more on increasing from the bottom down or the bottom to the sides. And then when you have it at the corner, it's going to increase from down and to the side. And then if you choose, an anchor at the bottom, then vice versa. It will focus on going up into the side, and then the bottom corner will be going up into the side as well. And so I'll just choose the center, and then I'll click resize. And now you'll notice that the lines that I created are in the center, and they're a lot smaller. And that's just because I increased the pixel size of the canvas. And so now every single pixel that I add is going to be smaller because the whole canvas is larger now.
So that affects the canvas and not the actual pixels?
Yeah, so it does affect the pixels because right now your pixels are big.
Yeah.
They look big because the canvas is small.
Okay.
But when you increase the canvas size, then the pixels will look smaller because you have a larger canvas.
Okay. So the top one is just the pixel size and the bottom one is the canvas size.
So the top one is it's all pixels. It's just that the canvas or the resizing of the canvas is how many pixels you have in your canvas. And so if typically your canvas or typically the lines on your canvas are like 1 pixel. And so just the 1 pixel line is just going to look smaller because the large canvas is more pixels.
I'll keep playing with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just did that by resizing it.
Yep. So now you can zoom out
Zoom out.
by using the middle mouse button or like the scroll wheel. Yep.
Oh,
Yeah. There you go. And so that's how you go through and resize your canvas. Another thing that you'll see is at the top right, you'll see this thing called 12 FPS. And what 12 FPS is, it's pretty much controlling your frame rate. So we mentioned that you can have, a larger frame rate or a smaller frame rate, and that can save you time and it can make things more fluid. And so by just moving the slider to the left or the right, you can increase it or decrease the frame rate. And so I'll keep it at 12 because I like 12, but that's how you change your frame rate, and frame rate just tells you how long it takes for you to go through the individual frames. And so the next thing we have is our layers. And layers are really good because they allow for you to create an animation with a sketch, and then you could add more details on another layer and more details on another layer. And so in order to add a new layer, you just go to the layer panel, which is right below the frames per second, and you just click plus, and then you could go through and you could rename that layer. And so we'll say this one is our lines. We could say that layer 1 is our sketch, and then we could create another layer, which will be our like colors. And you can just move the layers up and down so that they keep all the different details on it, right? So this is our sketch layer. I could change the color by going to the color palette in the left and say all of my sketches are going to be in red. So I'll have a circle in red. Then I could say all of my lines will be in like dark blue. So I could have dark blue for my core lines. And then for my colors, all of my colors I'll just fill in a color with green. So I'll just create a circle in green, and then I'll just fill it with the paint bucket tool, like that. And so now I have, my lines layer, my colors layer, and my sketch layer, all with these different things. And with Piskel, it lets you know what your color palette is. So at the bottom, you'll say, okay, what are the colors that I actually have in this sequence here? You'll actually be able to look at those right now with that. And so if you wanted to make the lines thicker, you have 4 different options for your pen size. And so going to the top left icon will be your pen. And that's pretty much the tool that you use to draw your different line work. If you wanted to increase the size, you can by clicking one of these 4 different boxes. And so you have 1 pixel, 2 pixels, 3 pixels, and 4 pixels. 4 pixels is obviously the biggest line. 1 pixel is the smallest line, and then 2 pixels is somewhere in between, and 3 pixels is somewhere in between as well. And then if you wanted to erase something, you could use the eraser tool, which is right here, which is also E. And the eraser tool just allows for you to erase all those pixels that you have in all of your layers, essentially. And then if you wanted to have rectangles, you can. If you wanted to have circles, you can. And if you wanted to select different areas of your rectangles and stuff, you can do that as well. And so those are the core tools that you need to get started. Does anyone have any questions before we actually get into animating?
I just created those lines for the layers, but now is it covered? I tried to go back to the original sketch.
Yeah, so what you actually did is you created another frame. And so looking over in the top left, if you select that,
okay.
Yep.
So how did I do that? I was just playing on this side.
I don't know actually.
Okay.
But yeah, if you just select that, if you select that again, then there you go.
So this is just a new frame.
Yep, it's just a new frame.
Okay.
How do you see the different layers together?
Yeah, so to see the different layers together at once, they should actually just appear.
Because I have this, and then maybe this background, but I can't make it.
Oh, so what you did is you have the sketch layer behind the background.
Okay.
So what you want to do is you see that arrow, the top arrow with that there?
Yeah.
Perfect. There you go. So with the layers panel, the layer that you want to show in the foreground should be at top. And so if you have so another way to look at it, and I'll just do that with this. Here, I'll just delete these layers. And I'll just rename this. This one will be our foreground. And then I'll create another layer, and this one will be our background. So foreground, background. I'll delete this. And so we'll say that we'll have a person like that. And then we want our foreground to be, with some grass. And so then when you see your actual animation, is it going to show up? No, it's not going to show up. Like you're going to see up here in your preview, up at the top right, it's going to have the foreground and the background combined. And so whatever you want in the foreground should be in the top layer, and then whatever you want in your background should be the bottom layer. Yeah. So before we get to animating, do we have any more questions? Nope. Okay. So what I will do is I will just refresh everything. And I'll say that this is just going to be my sketch layer. I'll just put sketch there. And typically when I'm animating, I like to work with different colors. And so my final draft will always be in like black lines. But when I'm doing like a sketch layer or something, it'll probably be in like a blue or like a red. That way I know, what layers I'm working on and what phases I'm working on, and it's easier to trace over. It's easier to trace over a brighter color to get your final line work. And so since we're doing this with a ball, what I'll do is I'll essentially start off with the ball. And so we'll start off with the ball up at the top. So I'll just start off with a circle, just like that. And with our animation, I mentioned that, animation is nothing more than just a sequence of events showing an illusion of motion, right? And so you'll find at the top here, you're able to add a new frame. And so by adding a new frame, it allows for you to have another instance of the motion that you're trying to show. And so with that new frame, you can do this thing called an onion skin. And what the onion skin does is it essentially shows what frame you had before, what drawings you had in the previous frame, and what drawings you have you hope to have or you may have in the frame before that, or the frame after that. And so think about like an onion, you're sort of peeling the layers of the onion back, and each layer has a different element to it. The same thing applies to animation here. And so onion skinning is a great tool to use to know where you went and where you're going to go. And so in this one, I have my first frame, which is up at the top, and I want my animation or my ball to go down to the bottom. And so what I'll show you now is essentially pose to pose animation, where we know where we started. We're going to create a frame that takes us where we want to go, which is going to be at the bottom, and I'll just draw that. So I'm going to select that frame that I just created, and I'm just going to draw a ball at the bottom. And you'll notice that when I drew that ball, the previous frame that I had is sort of grayed out a little bit. And so that's what onion skinning does, is it says, okay, we're going to show you the frame that you did before, and we're going to show you the frame that you're on now. And so now I have an idea of where I was and how I can incorporate that into my next frame. So with this, our ball first started off at the top. It came down to the bottom. And so our next frame is us just wanting to create the ball back up at the top again. And so what I'll do is I'll actually create I'll just duplicate that frame. So I want the ball to go back up to the top. I'll just duplicate my first frame and just drop it down, just drag it down to be frame number 3. So now what this looks like is when I play it, as you can see at the top right, the ball goes down to the bottom and then it comes back up to the top. Right? In a nutshell, this is animation, but by applying these principles, we're going to make it look a lot smoother, a lot more dynamic. Make it look like something that we actually want to see. And so we did our main 2 keyframes here. And so when we go back to the list of sort of frames that you should have, our 2 keyframes going down to the bottom and back up to the top, those are our keyframes. Now,
Tell me again how the onions skin it, because I can see them separately, but I can't.
yeah, so you see that it looks like an onion right next to where it says 12 FPS on the right. Click that, boom, and now you can see it.
Thank you.
Where is that again?
You see where it says 12
Oh,
FPS?
this time,
Yep,
onion?
right there. And so if you click it, then it'll show you that. And so now that we have our two keyframes, the best thing that we could do now is we could start from the outside, and then we could focus on the middle frame in between that. And so that's known as our in-between frame. And so an in-between frame, what we'll actually do is we'll go in between both frames, and we'll add a new keyframe. And with that new keyframe, what we'll do is we'll just make a drawing somewhere in between our first keyframe and our last keyframe. And so I'll just draw a circle here. And so now when you look at the actual like preview, now it's starting to look like it's a little more smooth. It's starting to feel smoother. And essentially you can repeat the same step for, keyframes 2 to 4 by creating another keyframe, making a drawing in the middle. Then we'll make another keyframe, put that between 1 and 2, and we'll make one in the middle. And then we'll make a keyframe between 5 and 6. We'll just draw it in the middle. Actually, I will draw that one a little bit better. And we'll just repeat that again. And we'll repeat that again. And so now at the top, what you're going to see is something a lot smoother now. And so something where we just have the ball just bouncing up and down. And so by doing this, essentially you're focusing on just creating the two keyframes. And then after you create those two keyframes, you do an in-between keyframe. And then you do the one between the in-between and the keyframe. And then you just sort of go from the outside in, outside in, outside in. And now you have something that's a lot smoother.
So you have 8 frames there of the in-between?
Yeah.
Okay.
So essentially, yeah, we started off with, this is our first keyframe. This is our second keyframe, which is at number 5. Then we made a keyframe for number 3. Then a keyframe for number 2. A keyframe for number 4. And then we essentially applied that for the motion going up. And so we sort of split it up into the motion of the ball going down to the ground, do all those keyframes and in-betweens, and then we go from the motion from the ball going from the ground to the top and doing all those keyframes and in-betweens.
When you start a new frame at the bottom, how do you see the other ones? If I start a new one, then, I can see the first one, but I can't see any of the other ones.
So go ahead and click it. Actually, I don't think there's any. Is there any? Okay, there you go.
Like over here, I've got
Yeah.
a bunch of them, but every time I just put guess where I just put guess where
Oh yeah, because there isn't actually one after that one, right? So that's the one at the top is the
Oh, so
last
if
one.
you move it in between first.
Yep, see, there you go. There you go. And so that's what I meant by playing around with the timeline, where the keyframes on the side are your actual timeline.
Yeah.
And so you can move those those frames up and down, and that changes how you're able to show the animation.
So I had a sketch originally, then I added color,
Mhm.
which was the yellow background. And then I created the line to create a sun, and I was gonna animate it to have move across, but I don't see this layer, so I don't know where it's hiding.
So the thing is that this all happens as like one frame, and you notice you have the line work there, right?
Yeah,
But it's being covered by the actual color and everything else. So that's the last layer at the bottom. So what you do is just move it up to the top.
okay.
See, and now you see.
Oh, okay.
And so the problem is that you run into is that now you have to replicate all of those details on the next frame.
Okay.
And so
And so this just shows my last layer of the,
yeah, so that's all your layers for that one frame. And so then you just make another frame, and then you essentially create all those layers again.
trace it down.
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't have to move it down. You
Oh.
just have to you just have the onion skin on, and you just click that next layer.
Okay, here,
Yep, click that right there.
or I could do.
Well, you'll make another frame, but if you click that one and like have it selected, yeah, then you'll see you have the onion skin now.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Ooh, look at those eyes. Oh, wow, look at that. How do you say that? So, yeah, you spell next word. And then. Yeah. Okay, so go back to the scale. And so did you, and which one did you download it at? Download as an animation. Try clicking Loop Review. Does that may work? Yeah, it is. That's one of the, I think it's.
So just want to fill in my little circle,
Might
but
be
it doesn't, and I did that, but it fills in the whole page, so. How do I just do the circle?
I don't know. Oh,
I
right there.
did it previously, this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is the pink all pixels,
If you know how to use like
same
Premiere or something like that, you can just stitch them all together.
thing?
Is it possible to look at that on the whole page?
Yeah, you can like do it as a pop-up, but I think it doesn't
You know,
necessarily
just
work.
to see it better.
Yeah, it's typically you should be able to use the pop-up window,
This,
But,
but it doesn't seem to.
but it doesn't work, and I think it's just because it doesn't work well with Safari. And so if we did it with like another browser, it should work better.
Can you keep up Chrome on them? It may not be in the taskbar, but if you did want to try another browser, we don't want to lose your work.
No.
So, yeah, it's the green. You just hit the green button. Should shrink it.
I don't know, I think.
And then, let's see. You can just try that. Let's see, not chess. Let's try Chrome.
Okay.
And we can see if that happens. And I wonder if there's a way to like pick your current work.
Well, there's this save thing, so I did that. Well, I exported it, but I don't work then.
So let's try to go to get that out of the way. So it's probably easiest just to search on Google. It's cool that Zillow's having a couple just really okay, so Sorry, you said you did try to save, so when you tried
Well, I
to
did
save
say
here,
that.
where did it say that? Let's just do the test again. So let's click there. See, that's dot fiscal, so let's try that. So just hang it down with your devices. So if we
Okay.
click here,
Uh-huh.
let's see, that works like a dot fiscal.
Oh, so
So-
maybe I can upload it. Mhm.
Maybe, let's go back over there. And so if one of these like load or or a pistol file. Great, so as local saves, let's try that. Nope. Let's try that thing again. Oh, that one, browse got pistol files. And it's just gonna be in the downloads folder. Let's try that, see if it actually brings over what we're expecting. So,
Ta-da.
and will it let you now pop out your little preview window? Is that your better?
Yes.
Okay, there it is, great. I'm not the expert, so if anybody needs to get a tip on
Okay, so now that we went over just a basic keyframe animation, now it's time to make it a little more dynamic. And so what we're going to do is we're going to I'll just start a new project to create a new sprite. Do that by creating a new sprite. Boom. And so what I'll do is I'll first just resize my canvas. I'll make it 300 again. Have it scale in the center. Resize it. So I should have a good, I should have a good size for my pen. And so now with this one, the goal is to have a ball bouncing from, side to side. And so it bounces in and then it sort of just like bounces away. And so I'll first start off again with just a red pen. And with this one, I'm going to create a layer. And this layer is going to be focused around being my guide. So I'll just name this a guide layer. And I don't know, I kind of like the red for the character, so I'll have the guide layer be blue. And so this guide layer, all I'm going to do with this guide layer is I'm just going to draw a line of it bouncing and hitting the ground, and then bouncing up, and then bouncing down. So you have one large loop, a medium loop, and then a tiny loop. And this is going to set the essentially the landscape for what our animation is going to be. And with this, I will just duplicate it a couple times, like that. And I'm duplicating it a couple of times because in Pascal it doesn't transfer over the other layers. When I create a new layer, or when I create a new keyframe, it doesn't transfer over like the layer to the next keyframe. And so by duplicating it, I'll keep the same grid or this same guideline across all my keyframes that I have. And so now that I have my actual now that I have my actual guide layer down, I'm just going to move over to my next layer, and this will be my sketch layer. Sketch layer will be at the top, and it'll be in red. And so I'll first start off with my ball, and it'll just be coming in at the top right here. And actually, I think I will make my animation a total of 10 frames. I think that makes things a little easier. And so in my animation, I will have, I think, my fourth frame right here, my fourth frame. I think that will be the area where my ball hits the ground. And so I'll say my ball hits the ground around frame 4. And right now I'm just sort of guessing. I don't really know how it's going to look, and I'll have time to actually modify it. But I'll just say, frame 4, the ball hits the ground. Frame 1, it's at the top. And then I'll say frame 7 or frame 6, it'll be at the top of the arc, the middle arc. And then frame 8, it'll be at the bottom of the small arc.
So all those frames have the same blue line, and then but it doesn't necessarily have the top ball, or does it have the top ball and the bottom ball now with your?
So what I'm doing is,
frame?
so what I'm doing with the blue line is it's just my guide for how I want the motion to go. And so the reason I duplicated it is because I'm able to use that same guide on every frame that I have. And so instead of creating a new frame, I could just duplicate this one and it becomes my template that I can use for the motion.
So frame 4 does not have the red ball at the top.
No, because frame 4, the red ball by frame 4, the red ball should be at the bottom.
Okay.
And so following the guide, I won't deviate away from the guide that I made. It's just that depending on the frame, the ball is going to be on a different part of the guide that I created.
That's why mine wasn't gonna do what I was doing.
And then on frame 10, it'll be sort of leaving the overall frame, right? And so now, if you could see in the like the preview, it looks like it's sort of kind of going up and down, following it. It's still a little shoddy, and so we'll just start to add more frames to it so that it looks a lot smoother, right?
So why is it that the guideline doesn't, and it's not gonna be visible? Do you delete it?
Yeah, so I'll end up deleting it.
Okay,
But this is just to help me.
right, but
So-
then you go back each frame and
Yeah.
delete the blue.
Yep, then you'll just go back each frame and then you'll just start to modify it and delete it and add details and remove stuff. And it becomes that process. And so right now we just have our main keyframes. And so now it's time to add the in-betweens. And so with this one, we know that from frame 1 to frame 4, all we're trying to do is get the ball from the top and get it all the way down to the bottom of that first arc. And so we'll do that by just, making the keyframe in the middle of it. And then a keyframe in the middle of that one. And you'll notice that I ended up having the ball feel a lot more stretchy.
Elongated?
Yeah, more elongated. And the reason I'm doing that is because when you have a motion, what we're actually seeing is sort of the smear of the object. And this is what the stretch is in the squash and stretch, where we're showing the motion. And actually, I will delete these ones and I will actually make it look a little more exaggerated. So I could have that motion come down like this and then come down like that.
And in doing the elongation, does that save you creating more frames to create that motion?
It does save you more frames. Well, I wouldn't say it saves you more frames. I think it allows for you to give the illusion of it moving fast. And so the longer you stretch something in a motion, what it's actually going to do is it's going to give you the impression that like physics and force is pushing it forward. And
As
so
opposed to a slow.
opposed to a slow drop. And so think about the effect that you get when you watch, like that effect that they have when in Star Wars or like Star Trek where they go on warp speed and they sort of like shoot back and then like their mouth opens up and everything just gets stretched out. That means they're going really fast. And so what we're doing is we're just mimicking that effect within this sort of microcosm of just a ball bouncing. And so in that same vein, when we stretch something, you know, we also need to squash something as well. And so when the ball hits the actual ground, we actually wanted to have a little bit of a, you know, a flattening or a squashing of that ball. And so we can modify that by having it just sort of get flatter and get more wider. And so when it's falling down, it'll get longer and it'll get skinnier. And then when it lands, it'll get flatter and it'll get wider. And so that just gives us the effect of it just sort of smashing and elongating and having it feel a little bit more bouncier. And so then you could go through and you could modify it even more. You'd say, okay, I don't want it to be that long. I'll go through and, you know, modify the length of it with the eraser, X, Y, and Z, and then move over to the other one. Boom, this looks okay. This looks okay. And so we go to frame 4 to 6. You know, we know that it's at the bottom, and in frame 6, it's going to be at the top of that arc. So we'll just do a keyframe of it being somewhere in the middle. Like that. And then the same thing for frame 7. We know that frame 6 is at the top, frame 8 is at the bottom. So we're just going to do a frame in the middle. And then in frame 8, I think I do want to squash it a little bit more. And then the same goes for frame 9, where we know that frame 10 is at the top, frame 9 is at the bottom, or frame 8 is at the bottom. And so we're just going to create like that. And so now when you look at the preview, it looks like it's actually, you know, there's an actual fluid motion that's happening between. And so to modify this a little bit more, we could actually we'll create a new frame, and I'll place that one in between 3 and 4. And what I could do with this now is I could actually animate the in-between of going from the stretching elongated part to the wide squash part. And that will add an extra frame to it, so it's going to go a little bit slower because there's an additional frame, but it's going to give a more fluid motion. And so what I'll do is I'll say, okay, somewhere in between, you know, this long part right here and this wide part is going to be something like this and that. And we'll just sort of create a shape right here. It doesn't have to be crazy. We're just sort of creating a shape to represent what that squashing is going to look like, or that tweening, or that motion in between. So now when you see it, it looks like it's actually like having that motion of it sort of like squishing down, just by adding that little frame right there. And so again, I could just create another frame, and I could do the opposite for between frames 5 and 7, where it's going from that flat and that wide, and it's going to become that elongated and tall. And so I'll just go through and say, okay, it's going to be somewhere in between this long and this wide. So I'll have sort of a base here, and I'll just create something like that. I don't really like that one. I have this base, And then I'll just create something like that. So it's just a random shape. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just creating a random shape. But this random shape represents what that motion would look like. And so now when you see it, it looks a little more fluid now, where you sort of are able to spend time and appreciate that it's actually sort of squishing, elongating, squishing, getting wider, and then it's sort of rebounding and coming back up. And so an additional thing that we could do is we could actually add keyframes to give the illusion of time holding or staying still for a moment. And so by duplicating the top keyframe, it forces the motion to pause a little bit while it gets up to the top. And so by adding an additional keyframe, you're able to really isolate on a specific keyframe in the motion. And so I could do that on the bottom frame, here on frame 4 or on frame 5, where it just gives me an extra split second. And then I could do that again on the bottom frame for frame 12. And so when I actually delete this guide frame, this guide layer, it's actually going to delete it on all of our frames. And so now we have a motion of a ball bouncing and squashing, stretching, and having the various effects that we wanted from our principles applied to just a ball bounce.
And so you just did that by deleting the blue off the palette.
Yeah, just once you delete the blue, then you just sort of see the principles play out. And so, once you just follow that guide, then you just place the drawings in the specific areas that you think will work. And then you could add some, you could remove some. But once you do that, then and you remove the guide, then the guide doesn't act as a distractor anymore. And so then you get to sort of appreciate, all the stuff.
And then if you solidified that circle, it would give it more solid presence.
Yeah. So what we'll actually do now is, I showed you pretty much the first part of that draft, right? So now, moving on to the next draft, you add a layer, and we'll just call this one Final Lines. Final. And so now I could go through, and with each one of these different frames that I have, I will use a black line, and I'll just go through and, do all the colors and everything now. And so this is sort of this becomes the part that you could just put on your headphones, and you're just tracing and making it look better at this point. And so I'll go through and I'll just make all the lines look nice now. So got that one. And here you could really modify it to the point where it makes a little more sense. So you don't have to stick to just tracing. You could add additional details to it as well. So say I don't want this to be as long. I could, I have full liberty to just say I want it to just be just slightly shorter, right? And I can go to the third one. I'll say this one will be a little shorter. And then this will come down. It'll squash, and I want it to be a little. Actually, I want this one to actually be a little taller. then I want this one to be a little wider. So it's gonna be wider and shorter. Then it's going to bounce up. Like that. Then I'll have it sort of come through like that. Modify it a little bit. Make this one a little wider. Coming up. And then it leaves the frame. And then lastly, I could just have an empty frame just to show that it left the frame. And so then, set the layer opacity to 0. So you can barely see it now, but I'll go through and I will just create a tank bokeh tool, and I'll just choose, we'll just choose yellow, some sort of yellow. And then I'll go through the coloring phase and I'll just add color to it. So boom, boom, boom. Oh no, did I? I actually did not even. No, this is to a frame that I don't need. Okay, cool. Okay, so I will go here. Boom. Get rid of the onion skin so I don't get tripped up. And I'm essentially just adding color to it, just using the color picker and color fill tool.
And then if you wanted to create shading, you would create another layer on top of those.
Yeah, you could create another layer if you didn't want to mess up the line work that you already had. And you just stick to the regular lighting that you sort of set up for the first frame. Ideally, you want to have the same like lighting condition. You don't want it to be all like trippy, but you have full creative license, right? And so from there, right, we have our animated ball bouncing from side to side. And with it, we can modify the frame rate to go even slower, right? So 6 frames per second, go slower. Or, it ends up looking a lot smoother when and more impactful when you increase the frame rate, right?
So if you're like doing raindrops too, you can make it slower,
Yes.
faster, that
Mhm.
same way.
And really the difference is that when you add you have a slower frame rate, you essentially want to have more frames in between each motion to give it that smooth feel. Otherwise, it would just get choppier because you just have less frames. And so, if you wanted to actually make it go slower, you would just improve. You would keep the same frame rate you want, and then you'll just add more frames as those in betweens, and as those in between motions. And so I animated it at 12 frames per second. So that's ideally what it will be, in there. But if I bump it up to 16, you have more of a, it feels a little more impactful. It feels like things motion is a little smoother, mainly because those frames lend to it sort of squashing and stretching in that motion a little bit more.
So in a little short, would it be typical that you can start it off at 12 and then move it up to 16 within the same little short?
No. Once you choose a frame rate, like you want to stick to that because typically devices will only run at a specific frame rate, and so there's ways within like game engines and stuff to like change the frame rate, but that's rendering stuff in like real time, and rendering in real time this is a whole nother beast in and of itself. And so this is all typically like pre-rendered. And so by the time you see it, it's already been rendered at the frame rate that you anticipate it being. And so yeah, it's a different beast. But yeah, I mean, like with it, after we finish animating, you're like, okay, well, 16 frames per second looks better, so I'll just keep it at 16, and then I'll export it out. Export it. And so that is pretty much the squash and stretch. And the squash and stretch allows for you to, as you can see, just have that interesting, motion, that motion effect that we've been talking about.
So how would you save them?
So in order to save it, you have a couple of options. You could save it by just clicking save, or if you wanted to export it out, you could export it out as a PNG sequence, a GIF, or a zip file of sprites. I typically do like a PNG sequence because it makes things a little easier. But you could export it out as a GIF as well, and you just click download, and I'll just say ball bounce. That should work. I think we may run into an issue. Yeah, we run into an issue because it's with the Mac, it does cause some issues. Let me see if this is going to work so I can get it.
So it's at 300 resolution.
Yeah. Okay, there we go. So it doesn't open up at it's not the best demonstration of it, but let me get this going. There we go. So I saved it as a ball bounce, and you can see it here.
As a gift.
Yeah, as a GIF. So, just sort of, just export it out and just make sure to save it as a GIF image. And then depending on how you open it, that's how you're able to, view it. Stuff. So this you could upload on Twitter. You could, upload to like an image, file hoster and stuff like that, and share it and all that stuff. So it's pretty cool. Pretty cool. And so we went over the squashing and stretching. We went over just how keyframing works and being able to build an animated sequence in and of themselves. And so the last thing that I have, because I think
Sorry, remember it is close to one time. We have to go whenever you're ready.
Ooh,
So just
yeah.
whenever you're ready to wind down, but I don't want to rush.
Oh yeah. So the last thing is just sort of how do you sort of put all this together to where you want to have a character, say you want to have somebody walking or jumping or whatever. How do you combine all that into something that's actually useful aside from being a ball, right? And so I'll just do a quick little, I guess, review of what we went over and apply those to a new little project over the next couple of minutes, right? So I have my layer, and my layer will just be a sketch like that.
Still a 32 by 30.
Huh?
Still, of course, a 32 by 32. So
Oh yeah, yeah. So what I'll do is I'll change it to 200. I don't need 300 right now. And so I have my 200 square right there. And so really quick, I'm used to like drawing pretty fast just as an animator. Time is money. And so the sooner you can finish something, the more you can move on to other projects. And so what I like to do is, actually make this a little bit smaller. What I like to do is I'll just work pretty rough. And I'll say, hey, I have a character with eyes. They're like that. And a mouth. We got a nose. And with my onion skin, I want them to look this way, right? We got the nose, mouth, head like that, right? So there's a thing that I mentioned called an arc that you'll typically do, right? And so with that arc, we know that in an in-between, we're going to have the head be in between those two. So the face is here. We'll have our eyes following that same line. We got the nose, mouth. And then I mentioned that we have essentially an anticipation. And our anticipation is saying that our goal is to go to the right. So we're actually going to sort of shift our head to the left before we go to the right. And so what that typically looks like is you're going to create a frame that's very similar to the first one we have, but everything is just going to be shifted slightly. And then we'll have another frame, and this one is supposed to be our overshoot. And the overshoot is typically the frame where we want to go to the right. We did go to the right, but we went a little too far, and now we have to rebound back. And so the overshoot is going to be the frame right before our final keyframe, and it's actually going to go past our final keyframe, and then our final keyframe is going to bring us back. And so we'll just essentially make a keyframe that's very similar to our last one. And we can see that in our onion skin. And it's just going to go a little further than we need to. And then with this one, I'll just duplicate this one once, duplicate this one again. And so now what we have something where the character is looking from the side. He sort of whips down, and we have that sort of arc motion as our in-between. And then we finish up with our final key pose of the character looking to the side. And so by applying the same things that we did with the ball, where we have, our anticipation, we have our keyframe, our in-between with a little bit of like squashing and stretching. Then we have our overshoot, and then our final keyframe. We have a motion. And then that motion just sort of multiplies across all the other motions we want to do. Where you could say, okay, the character moves their head, the character lifts their arm up, the character walks, the character jumps, and so on and so forth. You just apply those same principles, and then the only thing you have to work on is just really just making sure the drawings are consistent enough for it. But mind you, we just sort of just sketched this out, right? Like it wasn't like we really stuck to, a grid sheet or whatever. But you get the general gist that applying the same principles allows for you to have the illusion of motion just by having the eyes and the nose and the head and the mouth. And so from there, I mean, like this is I've been doing it for a while, so it's not as like it's not as complicated for me. It's always, you know, sort of procedural. You just have this keyframe, this keyframe, this keyframe, and then it all just sort of comes together once you stick to you know, the task. And so with that, you know, excited to see what you all are able to come up with Pascal. You know, it's a simple program. You know, allows for you to do a lot of amazing things with it fairly easily. But other than that, you know, I think we're all pretty hungry. We could, you know, use a snack after this, and so that's what I got for you.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Yeah.
Yeah.